escribir.
Morir es vivir.
Morir es vivir.
Morir es vivir.
Number 1. I recently reconciled with my mother over the holidays. Prior to that, we hadn't spoken to each other in 10 years. Our last meeting, to say the least, was hurtful, and both our pride and egos were sorely tested. She was always more domineering than my father, and when he died when I was still young, she became convinced that the true test of love was to smother me with her anxieties. Long story short, she projected all her anxieties and hopes on me and was stern when she thought I failed or did not live up to her expectations. That led to that one fateful night all those years ago, when I just couldn't take it anymore. Out of the blue, I just got a call from her asking to talk. And since I was still fresh from the failure of my startup, I thought, why not? So I packed up my bags and headed to my childhood home. But I would soon find out that it was not the same home I grew up in, to say the least. My mom belonged to one of the oldest families in the region, and although they are no longer as rich as they once were, they still were well off, but none of that was evident in the family home. I was surprised to see that she had replaced our old housekeeper with a new and older one, to cut on costs, so she said. But despite the more advanced age of the new housekeeper, there was something about her that suggested cunning, agility, and menace. Her eyes receded deeply into her eye sockets, and she walked with a cane that seemed inappropriate. For one, she seemed to stand all right without it. She bade me to wait a while in the living room. The formality was a bit intimidating, yet comical. All the art and antiques she collected were gone too. Instead, I found that she replaced them with statues of saints, like the ones you see in Mexican churches. I never thought of my mother as very religious. Sure, we used to go to church, but like everyone else, we treated it more as a social club than anything else. My eyes were drawn to a life-size crucifix she had installed in the living room. It was then I noticed it had 5 eyes, with a lidless one on the forehead, and it had this twisted grin. Soon I noticed that the other saints also had deformities. A statue of St. Peter had a monkey's head. The Virgin Mary was a crowned skeleton. St. Sebastian had 3 faces, and was plunging a knife into one of its mouths. It was really fucking weird to say the least. Then I heard the upstairs creak, and I knew someone was walking, perhaps going downstairs. I saw my mother in a long flowing white dress. It wasn't one of those hideously overpriced designer rags she used to wear, but rather a plain white linen smock with a long train that trailed behind. There was something almost penitential about it. She had a funny hat on her head too, which almost resembled a bishop's mitre. But it was not the sight of my mother which bothered me the most. What or who came after her was the most unnerving. Giddily bouncing behind her was an extremely fat little girl, probably no older than 7, with hair falling to her ankles. The girl, like my mother, was dressed entirely in white. My mother gave me a long look, smiled, and almost ran down to me. She said she missed me immensely and was so glad to welcome me back to the family. I was puzzled at this. She was estranged from her brother and sister, and I was sure I was her only child. Or was the girl beside her? As if reading my thoughts, she assured me that I was still the apple of her eye. The girl, however, was God incarnate, the so who has come to feast on our sins. She said all this with a genuine feeling, with a smile that never faded, and I felt repulsed. Welcome home, Jordan. I hope you can share in the great feast. I saw something flash in the little girl's eyes that night. Whatever it was inhuman, and I desperately need to get out of here.
Number 2.
I was on my way back to my college campus the Sunday night after 4th of July. I had driven through the roads along the swampy marshes of southern Louisiana just to get to my folks' house, and I was regretting it now. My mom had convinced me to stay for at least one Sunday supper, and now I would have to drive all night if I wanted to make it to classes on time Monday morning. I didn't really like driving on the back roads next to the bayou. The way the cypress trees rise out of the dark water on either side of the road creeps me out. They are really thick in some places too, and sometimes when I drive by them, my mind plays tricks on me. Like I might see a dark shape, and if I stare at it long enough, it might look like it's darting between trees, following my car, waiting for me to stop. I always get psyched out when the only lights come from my headlights. So I turned on the radio to get my mind off of things. It really provides a distraction from the looming trees and the overwhelming sense of dread that seems to overcome me. So on this particular evening, it was around 11:30 at night and almost pitch black out, except for the moon high in the sky, casting its silvery beams on the road. I was doomed to darkness. I started driving down a dirt road, with a tree-heavy bayou on the left, and a thick 10-foot-high underbrush on the right. Much to my dismay, the radio started breaking, cracking, and making static noises. "No, damn it!" I whispered, turning a few knobs. "I really don't need this right now." The static got louder and louder, until there was no trace of music, and it was just blaring static. Sighing in defeat, I turned back to the road just in time to see a dark figure appear in my headlights just before I hit it head on. I screamed and swerved to the left, feeling the front, then back tires travel over what I just hit. I swerved to the right again and slammed on the brakes, coming to a dusty, sudden stop in the middle of the road. I punched the steering wheel in frustration and hung my head in my hands. Had I just hit someone? I could kiss college and the rest of my life goodbye. Gulping, I got out of the car and left the door open. Peering out onto the moonlit road, I saw a dark, crumpled figure lying about 30 feet away. It wasn't moving. The warmth of the summer air, muggy and hot, washed over me. It didn't feel pleasant at all. Mosquitoes and flies were buzzing everywhere. I had to swat them off as I looked down the road at the body. "Fuck!" I whispered. I jogged down the road yelling, Sir, are you alright?" to the figure who, admittedly, probably wasn't alright at all. I reached it and got down on one knee. It was lying face down. I turned it over and stepped back in shock. It was a dummy. A padded dummy dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. The impact with my car had ripped its chest open, causing stuffing to spill out onto the road. "What the fuck?" I whispered, feeling more scared than ever. I looked up, eyeing the tall bushes ahead of me and the dark bayou beyond that. There was no logical explanation for a dummy being out on a deserted back road like this. Before I could ponder this further, a sudden breeze picked up, rustling the bushes. A low moaning suddenly picked up, circling around me. I looked in all directions, looking for a cause of the moaning, but I saw none. Suddenly, a loud scream came from somewhere behind me. It was a cry of pure terror and desperation. I screamed myself and turned back to look down the road. There, between the bushes, a red face stared. A bright light, probably from a flashlight, came from the right of the face. I put my hands up to see the face in the bushes. It was the face of a young woman. A large cut was on her forehead, causing crimson to run down her face until only her bright eyes stared at me from behind the mask of blood. I could only stare on in disbelief. The girl opened her mouth and screamed again, causing more blood to leak out of her mouth and run down her chin, staining the dusty road below. I still couldn't see who was holding the flashlight because the light was blinding me. I screamed and started to run back towards my car, but much to my horror, I saw one black-gloved hand close the door from the inside and turn the keys, starting the engine. Then it took off down the road, sending up clouds of dust as it went, until it was out of sight. I turned back to the bushes where I had seen the face, where it had only been moments before. It was now a body, A real body lying in the road. I rushed over to it and, seeing the condition, got up and ran over to the swamp, almost vomiting. It was a young woman, about 20. The large cut in her forehead had plastered her hair to her face with blood. Her throat had been violently slashed, staining the road red. Her body only dressed in a t-shirt and underwear. She was covered in burn marks and scratches. Her fingernails had been pried off. I moaned and stumbled back to the road. That's when the giggling started. Over the moaning wind, a high, childlike giggle swept over the dark bushes and trees. It wasn't a child. It was obviously an adult trying and failing to sound like one. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I turned away from the body and ran. I ran down the road, eyes flicking from right to left, looking for movement of any kind. Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I had to get the hell away from here as soon as possible. I didn't want to end up like that poor girl on the road. The sadistic giggling grew fainter and fainter until I couldn't hear it anymore. After 5 minutes, I arrived at a T-junction. An old sign pointed north, towards Church Point. The one to the right pointed towards Baton Rouge, which was near my college. I turned onto this road and was greeted by the sudden sound of chanting.
Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir. Morir es vivir.
I looked off to the left and saw a small glow in between the trees. I squinted my eyes and walked closer. Some people were standing around a fire, tossing things into a pot that was suspended over the flames. They were all wearing some kind of deer mask made out of sticks and twine. Suddenly they began dancing around the fire in erratic twirling movements. One who was much taller than the other stood back, holding a large book. He was wearing nothing except what appeared to be a goat mask. Suddenly, he began reading in a deep, booming voice.
All hail the fallen angel Lucifer.
"Hail to the fallen angel," the dancers repeated as they continued their strange ritual.
He sees the blood that we spill in his honor, and he is grateful to us, for we are his chosen disciples.
The dancers repeated this as well.
He is one. He is power.
The dancers stopped dancing and circled around the man in the goat mask.
All hail Lucifer, Lord of Darkness.
The hooded figures whooped and cheered at this.
Now, let us begin the celebration of this sacred nocturnal festival. Let us begin the consumption of flesh.
The hooded figures almost snarled with pleasure, then drew daggers from the folds of their robes. They lunged at the man with the goat mask, stabbing him over and over while I stood back, horrified. They shoved the now dead man to the ground and jumped on top of him, covering him so I couldn't see, laughing crazily the whole time. I heard the sound of tearing flesh and looked away, moaning with fright. I stumbled back in disbelief and turned back to the road, only to see a small figure about 10 feet away. I screamed and took a step back. It was a very young girl, about 10, wearing black robes but no mask. Her hair was very light blonde, almost white. Her eyes were bloodshot, pupils red. She cocked her head to the side and smiled at me. She lifted one arm, pointed a finger at me, and began to laugh. It was a high, thin, terrifying sound that caused me to clap my hands over my ears. Then she snapped her fingers. Out from the trees behind her stepped about 20 other people, all dressed in black robes and deer masks. Some of them cocked their heads, eyeing me suspiciously. Then the girl stomped her feet and yelled something in a strange language I didn't recognize. All at once, the masked figures began running towards me. I screamed and turned the other way, footsteps thudding in the dirt, towards the swamp. It was my only way out. Behind me, I could hear the girl laughing with pure delight. I jumped into the swamp and between many cypress trees that towered above me, the grimy water was only about 2 feet deep. I could hear angry shouts from behind me, and more sounds of feet hitting the water. I felt something whiz by past my ear. I watched a dagger hit the water ahead of me, and then sank into the darkness. They chased me around the swamp for what seemed like forever. The moon got lower and lower in the sky, but it still remained very dark. Every time I thought I was safe, I would see another one, about 30 feet away, staring at me from the empty sockets of their mask. Then I would turn, splashing away. At one point, I tripped over something and went headfirst into the water. Getting up, I was horrified to see I had tripped over a skeleton. Black, rotten flesh, still clinging to a few of its bones. In the end, I jumped behind a tree and sank until I was up to my neck. Sitting on the muddy bottom with my knees up to my chin, I closed my eyes and prayed the cultists wouldn't find me. I heard splashing and angry shouts for about another 2 hours, until they steadily grew fainter and fainter, until they couldn't be heard anymore. I still waited until the sun was high in the sky before I got up and began trying to find my way out of the swamp. 3 hours of splashing, tripping, and guessing later, I found a dirt road and began following it. Almost collapsing with exhaustion, I eventually reached a small gas station and shambled through the door. It must have been quite a sight. Slopping wet, covered in scratches, bruises, and blood. After quickly explaining to the horrified clerk I needed help, I used the phone to call the police. They seemed skeptical at first, but they agreed to send a squad car out to the location I described. I then called my mom, asking her to pick me up. The police never found my car. They were able to follow the tracks in the dust for a while, but the dirt road eventually hit a paved one, and they were unable to trace it anymore. The police found the girl's body on the road, and immediately called a search party to comb through the swamp. I was told they found over 35 bodies, most of them in late stages of decomposition, weighed down in the swamp with rocks. They found 2 fresh bodies, the girl in the road, and another deep in the woods. Her heart had been cut out. As for me, whenever I visit my parents, I take an alternate route along the interstate. It may not be as fast, but I prefer it much more than the dark, twisted back roads of the swamps, where hooded figures run between the trees.
There's always a reason.